Hi, I'm Debbie Ingram, the host of a special Under the Dome series of interviews on affordability in Vermont. We're focusing primarily on taxes, housing costs, and income. And my guest today is Steph Yu, who is the Executive Director of Public Assets Institute. Nice to have you, Steph.
Thanks for having me.
And we're going to actually, with Steph, we can talk about both taxes and income. And actually, I think we're going to touch on housing as well. So Steph's organization.
All related. Mm-hmm.
That's right. It's kind of a full service looking at the Vermont economy and Vermont fiscal policies and how they affect working people. So so let's just dive right in then we'll start with taxes.
Okay.
So there are a variety of different taxes, of course, that all Vermonters pay. Income tax, property tax, sales tax being the most common. But one of the things that would be helpful, I think, to viewers is to show a few examples of how much in taxes people of different income levels have to pay. So could you tell us about that?
Great. So I'll get into that. And I think you did a good job sort of naming the big three of taxes, right? The most common: income, property, and sales. And they have very different effects kind of across the income distribution, sort of at baseline, right? So, and I want to give credit. We work with an organization at the national level called ITAP, or the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, who every few years does this great report exactly on that, comparing states. And I think it's I want to start with this idea that Vermont is one of the few states that doesn't make income inequality worse through their tax system. We don't quite have a progressive tax system, meaning that higher income people pay more, but we also don't have a very regressive tax system, meaning that higher income people pay the least, which is true in a lot of states. So it really makes income inequality worse in a lot of states. So Vermont's one of the better state tax systems from that perspective. But just to show, so I've got a couple of slides here, and again, this is all credit to ITAP. So the first is sort of gives you the distribution of across the different income levels, the total taxes. This is state and local taxes as a share of family income. So you can see it's not quite progressive because that top 1% pays less than a lot of the middle class in there. But you can see that shape, and that's very different. If you look at what it looks like average across the country, it's very different. You can see it's much more regressive in the sense that lower income people are paying more. And a lot of that has to do with how much they rely on state and on sales and property taxes. Oops, that's not the one. So we can kind of look at sales and income tax. Sales is one of the more regressive taxes. This is Vermont specific information, but it's pretty true across. And the reason is, right, everybody has to buy a certain amount of stuff, but it takes a bigger bite out of smaller incomes, right? So you can kind of see, you don't just keep buying more and more stuff the more money you have. So sales taxes tend to be regressive. Personal income taxes can be flat or they can be progressive. And Vermont has a pretty progressive personal income tax, so you can see it actually corrects a little bit for the lowest income people. There's money back through tax credits and that kind of stuff. So a lot of states have progressive income taxes, and that's part of how they offset the regressivity of their sales and property taxes. And then where Vermont's sort of the most unique, I think, is their property tax structure. As we know, a lot of people pay their school taxes either based on income or based on property value or a combination. And because we make income taxes, school taxes income sensitized, we actually have a weird shape of a property tax where we're sort of progressive on the low end and then regressive on the high end. Most states have a regressive property tax, meaning that the more they rely on property taxes, it takes a much bigger bite out of lower income people. So that kind of gives you a sense. And I think we could compare to a couple other states, like the states without income taxes, like New Hampshire and Florida, rely more heavily on either sales or property taxes, and so end up having a much more regressive system. Meaning that lower income people pay a much bigger share of their income in taxes.
Right, okay, yes. And could you say more about why the property tax, why the people at the very top wind up paying less? Could you comment on that a little bit more?
Sure. So our school tax system, you may know, we're income sensitized through depends on the year because there's sort of where's the tipping point. But in FY25, in the current year, around $115,000 in household income, it becomes cheaper. So in Vermont, we get to choose, right? We pay the lower of the income bill or the property bill, essentially. And so for higher income people, it tends to be much cheaper for them to pay based on their property value. So once you hit about 115, some years it's more like 130,000 in property and income, you just pay exclusively based on property value, and it becomes regressive. So for the people paying based on property value, which are the higher income Vermonters, it's a better deal.
I see. Okay, right. Yeah, interesting, because I don't think people
I don't think
necessarily
people
think of it
understand
that way.
that. And the income sensitivity does help people at the low end. We have a bunch of, we have a bunch of policies that allow people to pay based on income, which does make it more progressive for the lower income folks.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Great. So we also hear a lot in the kind of political rhetoric that tax burdens cause people to actually leave Vermont. Is there evidence of that? And if so, which taxes are the ones that are the culprit?
So I think the answer is all of the evidence does not show that, right? You might have the occasional anecdote about somebody leaving because they don't like how their taxes changed, or they don't like something, but all of the research shows that there's really no major impact. So, and we just released a report, and I can send you some slides. I didn't bring them, but we always call these the Christmas tree charts, because when you look at migration for taxpayer migration across the states, they're even, right? So there's just as many people coming in as coming out. And they actually go back and forth to a lot of the same states, right? So it's not even like there's all these people moving to Florida. It's like there's a lot of people moving to Florida, and there's a lot of people moving from Florida to Vermont. So the top 10 states that people move to, I think 9 of them are in the top 10 states that people move from. So it's really a wash. And I think it's also just worth noting that in any given year, 96% of taxpayers are staying put. Right, so we're really talking about a little bit on the margins, even just the people who move. Not talking about the people who move for tax reasons, but just the people who move is a very small fraction. Cumulatively over the last 20 years, it's a shift in population of about 3,000, and that's plus 3,000 to Vermont and taxpayers. But recently, this most recent report, they look at both age of the taxpayer and income levels of the taxpayers, and what we found is that we're actually net positive on higher income taxpayers. So again, I think you hear people complaining that they're moving for tax reasons, but it really, in aggregate, it doesn't actually make a difference. In fact, so anytime taxes have been raised, New Jersey's done a millionaire's tax, Massachusetts has done it. We also have some localities who've done it. There's no evidence that show a lot of people leaving because of changes in state tax policy. And part of that, I think, is because the federal tax picture is so much bigger of a deal than your state tax picture, right? Your federal taxes are much bigger than your state taxes. So when you look at your overall tax picture, it's really the federal changes that make the biggest difference in what you pay.
Okay. And how would you view what the comparison between what people get for their taxes? So taxes are meant to pay for goods and services, right? So Vermont versus what we value and what we want to provide in goods and services versus maybe some of these other states like New Hampshire, Florida that don't have income taxes.
Sure. So I think it's a good question in terms of goods and services. I think what part of the education funding conversation I think that's been happening in Vermont is this concern that we're spending a lot on public education, right? That we're kind of in the higher range. But the truth is we've always been in the higher range, right? It's not a change. And that's really a regional thing. The Northeast tends to spend a lot on public education, and there's other regions where they spend much less. And I think it's worth noting that part of the reason that that number is high is because we have less inequity, right? In a lot of other states, the reason that they might spend less on education is because they're really underfunding poorer districts. And so there might be a handful of richer districts where they spend more, but at the baseline, they're spending less, right? So I think it's actually an indicator that we have less inequity than a lot of states. And we're basically spending the same share of our economy on public education. It's been flat for 20 years. So if you look at it adjusted for inflation, it's really pretty flat. So I think that's the biggest thing the state does. So that's why, I think that's part of why it's such a big conversation, is because it is the biggest job is public education. It's a huge part of our state budget.
Great, okay. And then let's transition a little bit to the single biggest cost that most households pay for, which is housing. Can you give us some information on what percentage of Vermonters' income is spent on housing?
Yeah, so how HUD, so the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, defines unaffordable housing is if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing. And so we look at that every year, and we just released our State of Working Vermont report in early January, which kind of looks at where that is. And so the majority, and it's a growing share of people are in unaffordable housing, meaning that they're spending more than 30% of their income, and even a growing share is spending more than 50% of their income on housing. So you see what a big, and it really skews differently for renters versus homeowners. It's much higher for renters, right, the share, although it's a majority of both, right? I think I'd have to go back and double check the numbers, but it's in the range of 60% of homeowners are spending more than 30%. And that's with incomes under 75,000. So we kind of look at that share. And then most renters have incomes under 75,000, whereas homeowners sort of run the gamut. You know, renters tend to skew lower income than homeowners. So you're seeing more and more people paying more than 30%, more than 50%, and to your point, yeah, a much bigger share of your household budget. And I think we're seeing that particularly in Northwest Vermont, although it's true across the state too. And I think it's worth pointing out, that's not a Vermont-specific problem. That's happening all around the country. Right, it's a little bit exacerbated in Vermont because we're small. Because the ability to grow is limited, and also because I think we have a lot of our renters are concentrated in certain areas, so it makes a bigger difference in certain areas of the state.
Right, so that would be kind of our more urban areas, Burlington, Brattleboro, that's right?
Yeah. Okay. Larger share of renters in the population, right? So a bigger difference in terms of what that rental market looks like and the impact.
Right, okay. Okay, and then also kind of switching gears again. So when we think about economic policies, there's kind of two sides to an equation, right? There's how much people pay out for things that they need, and there's also how much they take in terms of the income, the wages that they make. So I think Public Assets has kind of an opinion about this. How do you analyze that two sides of the equation?
Well, we did an analysis of the facts, so this just isn't our opinion, but I will say we have a perspective on what the solution is, for sure. Okay. But looking at the numbers, so part of our State of Working Vermont report, and I think we could again, we can send you more of these slides, but the State of Working Vermont report, one of the things that we look at is wages relative to the costs. And so what we find in Vermont, and this has been true for as long as we've been looking at it, which is 20 years or more, that our costs are pretty much at the national average, and that's a combination of everything. So that's housing, healthcare, sort of all the things put together, are at the national average, but our wages are below average. And the gap in Vermont between the average wage and the average cost is bigger than most states. We have one of the biggest gaps. So that's a problem. And we try to dig into a little bit how much of it is a wage problem, how much of it is a cost problem, and the answer is yes, all of the above, right? So to your point, housing, healthcare tend to be higher in Vermont. So those are big costs that tend to be higher in Vermont. And then wages, why are wages lower in Vermont? Is it the mix of jobs that we have, or is it for the same job in Vermont you get paid less than for the same job in another state? And again, the answer is all of the above. One of the things that we found, I think that people were surprised to find in this most recent report, was that the minimum wage in Vermont has lost ground too, right? So every 2 years, the legislature puts out a report on what's the livable wage in Vermont. They look at basic needs budget, the cost of basic needs. What they found was that a livable wage in Vermont is around $19 an hour, and our minimum wage is about $14 an hour. So you can see that gap has actually grown because costs are growing faster than the wages are growing. So, so there is this mismatch problem, and the answer is that we have to do something on both sides, both the cost side and the wage side.
It seems, just kind of what I hear in common parlance, right, is that the South, people who move to places like North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, that incomes aren't very high there, but also expenses, really aren't very high there. But people who stay in the Northeast, I mean, we try to increase our incomes to meet the needs, but sort of it's always out of reach. What's the reality about that sort of situation?
I mean, I think there's some truth to that reality, and to your point, sort of what are the services that you get relative to the cost. Again, I think schools being one of the bigger costs that has an impact in terms of the services. So there is some truth in terms of, and to that point, lower, wages lower, costs average in Vermont, that gap is bigger. So I do think you get lower costs and lower wages in a lot of the Southeast or various places. So you do see that. And you do see the opposite, right? Like the Massachusetts, the Californians, the New York, they tend to have higher costs, but they also tend to have higher wages, right? So, and there's always two sides to the story, right? It's a different picture for lower wage workers than it is for higher wage workers. We're looking at average wages in this case. So in California, New York, and Massachusetts, the average wage might be higher, but that's a lot because you have a handful of people making a lot of money. You got tech CEOs, hospital CEOs, sort of those kind of jobs that we don't really have that many of in Vermont. But that doesn't necessarily say what's going on with the lower wage workers. But California, Massachusetts have higher minimum wages. New York has higher minimum wages. So part of what we were surprised about with the minimum wage was Vermont. Vermont's a state where we actually do have the minimum wage go up automatically with inflation, which is huge. But we still haven't caught up. So we used to have one of the highest minimum wages in the region, and now we're the lowest, not counting New Hampshire, because they stick with the federal minimum wage, right? Which is $7.25 an hour still.
Yeah.
But we had been ahead, and now we've fallen behind. So I think that's a really easy way where, that's a easy state policy to change.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, yeah, let's stay on that track. What are some other policy recommendations then that you make when you go to the legislature, or that you see based on the evidence that you've looked at?
So I think to your question, I think there's a lot. We have to do something both on the cost side and the wage side. Minimum wage is one piece of it, but there's also a lot of pieces. I think people look at sort of scheduling costs. It's not just what you make per hour, but it's also how consistent are your hours. What does that look like, especially in sort of the retail and hospitality industries? Are you guaranteed the shifts? What does it look? Sort of all those kind of questions. And those are places where we can work. Certainly we see Vermont hasn't fallen off in terms of unionization quite as much as the rest of the country, but certainly organizing makes a big difference. You definitely see higher wages for organized industries or organized roles. So that's one piece. I also think, and this is a question again that comes up a lot with the education funding conversation, right? Vermont's healthcare costs have grown the fastest in the country in the last couple of years. And so the out-of-pocket costs for healthcare, pretty high in Vermont, what people are paying on the exchange, but also sort of, what's happening with employer-based healthcare too. We're seeing some big jumps. It kind of leveled off for a while. I think people were really concerned about the kind of accelerating cost of healthcare maybe a decade ago. Then we had the Affordable Care Act, sort of leveled off a little bit, and now we're back in a space where the cost of healthcare is really growing pretty fast, like double-digit growth year over year. And that's sort of looking at both what we're spending in healthcare and also what the out-of-pocket costs are for folks. So a lot of times you might be paying more if you're getting your insurance on the exchange, or paying more for your premium. But also if you're an employer-based, your cost might not go up that much, but you might be getting less for it, right? Your deductible might be higher. All these sort of out-of-pocket costs might be shifted, your co-pays, whatever. So, and that's one of the concerns I have with the public education conversation, is that healthcare was one of the biggest drivers of the increase in FY25, and none of the conversation is addressing that problem. So that's something I think we really need to be paying more attention to. So to your point on the housing, I think there's been a lot of good work by housing advocates in the state that we've looked at and support in terms of what it takes to. It's all of the above, right? We need more units. We need to manage the cost of the units we already have. We also need social services for unhoused folks. We need wraparound services, so we need more sort of supportive housing units. The housing thing is sort of like, we need all of the tools.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great, okay. And so finally, I'm trying to ask everybody that I speak with, we hear this word affordability, and it's kind of in the political rhetoric. But how would you define affordability?
Right. So we want a state that's affordable for everyone. So looking at, again, I think it's much more about the wage cost problem than it is about the cost of your taxes, right? So again, Vermont is one of the few states whose tax system doesn't make inequality worse. We could do better. We could have a tax system that actually improves income inequality and is wholly progressive. So that's one piece. But really, yeah, it's about affordable for whom. I think a lot of the conversation in public has to do with this fear of rich people leaving the state. So our tax policy is more designed to make sure that rich people don't leave the state than it is to make sure that everybody else can afford to live here, right? So again, tax credits are a piece of it. We have done more on the earned income tax credit, setting up a state child tax credit. Like done some positive things, I think, in the state toward affordability, but there's a lot more to do.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. This has been a great conversation with Steph Yu, the Executive Director of Public Assets Institute, and we've touched on all three of the topics of our special series on affordability in Vermont: taxes, housing costs, and income. And so I invite you to continue to view our series on these important topics.